Hi everyone, my name is Jerome and I'm the founder of Midgard. And our goal is to make the video game industry more sustainable, one game at a time. I'm sure everyone watching this video has read similar headlines like these over the last couple of years. Products, companies, and even events are making claims that they're carbon neutral, or at the very least, be carbon neutral by a certain date. But let's take a quick step back and discuss what carbon neutrality is in the first place. Simply put, it means matching the amount of emissions that you have with the amount of carbon sinks that are available to you. Carbon sinks are any mechanisms that can capture carbon. So this can be in the form of oceans or most obviously the forest. As you can imagine, there's also a bit of an imbalance here, as the amount of emissions that we have are rising rapidly or outpacing the amount of carbon sinks that we have. But we can solve this in three ways. Either we lower emissions, we increase carbon sinks, or we do both at the same time. The problem is that changing processes is required for lowering emissions, and that can be quite difficult for most companies. That's why we're leaning towards increasing carbon sinks. Lately, you might have also heard things like carbon offsets or carbon credits, which are basically financial activities that help finance reforestation projects or, let's say, technology that captures carbon and then stores it in another form. But the thing is that we can't buy carbon credits forever. So eventually, there will need to be a change in processes for us to lower our emissions, which would then lead to what they call net zero. Net zero means that your activity emits no emissions to begin with. With expected changes in legislation both in the EU and in the US, carbon accountability is something that is being asked both by consumers and employees from corporates. This is why, over the last couple of years, you've heard thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of companies made these pledges to be carbon neutral by a certain date. And these companies range from industries like oil and gas, banking, real estate, and even retail. But there is an industry that has been glaringly absent until recently, and that is games. It was only last year that the biggest game companies have made these pledges to be carbon neutral. I mean, we all know the numbers, right? The game industry is going to be worth 500 billion by the end of the decade. It's the most profitable form of entertainment, blah 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 blah. But why is gaming so slow in admitting it when we are an obvious emitter, especially more recently due to the rise of online games and web3 games, which are known to be quite energy intensive? First, I thought that maybe we just don't care, or maybe we just don't want to acknowledge the climate crisis, right? But that actually can't be farther from the truth. A study done by Yale and Unity showed that 73% of gamers actually acknowledge climate change. Not only that, but half of these people think that climate change is because of us. So I ran a little experiment to test this out, and I created a robust gameplay emissions model. Basically, this model takes up to 15 variables and estimates your carbon emissions during gameplay. And take note, it's not just a simple carbon calculator. It was actually quite robust and took me a long time to build. What I did was that I asked 20 of my friends to use this carbon model. And I instructed them that for every 10 kilograms of carbon, they will donate $1 to a tree planting project that I chose beforehand. Of these 20 friends, can you guess how many people actually made donations after knowing their emissions? You'll be shocked, but all of them did. Not only that, but two of them came back to me after a couple of weeks and told me that they started looking into installing solar panels in their houses. But unfortunately, it was a bit too expensive for them at that moment. But to me, it got the point across. Now, everybody will be affected by climate change, but assuming that we stick to the status quo, millennials, Gen Z, and younger are going to be the ones that will be most affected by it. Interestingly enough, this cohort also makes up the majority of two markets: the gaming market, but also the sustainability alternatives market. 48% and 49% of millennials and Gen Z, respectively, will pay a premium for sustainably made products. Not only that, but they also place sustainability within the top five decision making factors they take when making purchases, both online and offline. As you can see, I think you know where I'm getting to at, right? Because with 3.1 billion gamers worldwide, I find it impossible that the gaming industry can't have a hand in helping solve climate change. And that's exactly why I made Midgard. Just a quick plug, Midgard is a carbon measurement and reporting software for the game industry, and we provide solutions for both game developer and the gamer themselves. For game developers, we provide them tools to be accountable for their own carbon emissions and basically certify their games. At the same time, we provide these gamers a curated list of games that we've certified, as well as ways to mitigate and offset their own emissions during gameplay. Here's how it works. First, we collect data from the developer across all of their activities. This can be done on an ongoing basis or retroactively. Once we have their data, we use an in house modeling technology to basically estimate their carbon footprint. And we also write a full report on them, which we publish on our website. We think that full transparency on our findings is important when it comes to carbon disclosures. At the same time, we also provide these developers assets to highlight the sustainability aspect of their game, which they can use in game packaging, game trailers, and splash screens. Apart from supporting carbon accountable creators, gamers can also mitigate their own emissions by purchasing offsets for that particular game. We work with all kinds of games, from back catalog games like Mega City Force. Undream Games is using sustainability as a way to promote their upcoming port to Nintendo Switch. We also work with explicitly climate themed games like Spilled, which is a cozy game where you play as a ship cleaning up oil spills. It's recognized by Kickstarter and was funded in under 12 hours. And Lente, the developer, is using carbon accountability as a way to bolster her commitment to sustainability. But we don't just work with independent games. We also work with AA and AAA studios for accounting their own emissions. Songs of Silence is Chimera Entertainment's biggest game in their 18-year career. And not only are they accounting for their own emissions, but they're also going to be actively offering our offsets to the people that will be playing their games. Our intention is not to just decarbonize, not to decarbonize games, but also help gamers transition into more sustainable practices. Because there have been studies showing that people, for example, who buy electric vehicles have lower indirect emissions unrelated to driving. And it's because this purchase subconsciously affects your decision making process. And we hope that this flywheel works with the gamers as well. This is how we see it. Developers use sustainability as a game feature, and gamers sees this when they purchase the game. After purchasing, they learn about the developer's own efforts to be sustainable, and hopefully they're inspired to look at their own consumption as well, just like what happened to my friends. After reflecting on their own consumption, they start taking steps in reducing or mitigating their emissions, which can be in the form of switching to renewable energy sources, supporting carbon credit projects, and supporting creators that are carbon accountable. Hopefully, down the line, developers and publishers realize that sustainability is going to be a requirement in the future, not just in terms of legislation, but of customer demand. So they implement sustainability in future titles. And hopefully, as I said, that the flywheel continues. But the big question is, what are some of the best practices that studios can implement now in order to reduce their carbon emissions? Now, all of the data that I'm about to show are simply based off of our own findings with the games and studios that we've been working with. The most glaring thing that we noticed is that remote work is the way to go. As you can imagine with games, most of the emissions would come from their scope 2 emissions, which are emissions from the use of electricity. We found out that, well, for example, for this particular game, it's a AAA game that we've been working on for the past couple of months, and they have just a little under 120 employees. We estimated that their carbon emissions simply from the electricity usage are at 275 tons. And this is because they all work at an office. Now, we looked at the same amount of people doing the same amount of hours, but simulated that they're working from home in that particular city. And we found out that doing so can actually lower your emissions by more than half. Just this simple decision of working from home instead of an office can reduce your emissions by half. Now, to us, that's amazing. But working from home isn't just the end, right? Because every home is powered differently. And what we found out even further is that choosing the right energy provider can also lower your emissions even further. Now, taking the same cohort of employees that are working from home in theory, and we assume that they just used a traditional electricity provider known in that particular country. But upon simulating, for example, that they switch to a renewable energy provider, this can lead to carbon emissions cuts of 50% even further than the original. This means that working from home and choosing the right energy providers for your home are pretty much 50% of the game's emissions. And it's something that can be done or implemented quite easily. The other thing that we notice is that gamers or that developers and publishers should also think twice about having physical outputs. And physical outputs can be anything like physical discs, t-shirts, freebies, or other merchandise. And I know that for a lot of independent developers, this is not really going to be an issue, as the majority of you would prefer to distribute digitally anyway. But for a lot of AA to AAA games, physical sales still make up quite a big chunk of their sales. Although there isn't really a publicly known number, there has been first-party developers from certain console manufacturers that reported 60% of their sales coming from physical titles. Now, let's take a quick look at what the emissions are for manufacturing, transporting, and disposing of a disc. And that is around 20 kilograms of carbon. Assuming that a studio is expected to sell, let's say, 500,000 titles, and if we go with the fact that they will sell 60% of these via physical means, then that will lead to 300,000 physical sales. Now, 300,000 times 20 kilograms will lead to 6,000 tons of extra emissions. Now, to put that into perspective, that's the same amount of energy as 710 homes powered for an entire year in the US, over 534,000 gallons of diesel, and 13,537 round trips from Amsterdam to Malmo, only because you produced a disc. That's a lot. Finally, something to keep in mind is that in the next couple of years, your studio might be recommended to disclose their emissions. And this might be especially true for those watching that expect that their games will be quite popular over the next couple of years. And maybe you expect that you will reach a certain revenue threshold over the next 2 or 3 years as well. We think that online carbon calculators are good places to start. But if you really want to be serious with it, we do suggest working with a carbon accounting provider like Midgard or others, and making sure that you keep the proper documentation that will be needed for the analysis. And this is because for carbon disclosures, having the proper documentations like your receipts, energy bills, proofs of purchases, and similar documents are going to be required to make an accurate analysis. Again, online carbon calculators are a good way to start, but in the near future, they're not going to be enough to support your carbon disclosures. So even though you're not ready to count your carbon just yet, or if you're a starting studio that's just eager to get your game out, just keep in mind to keep those receipts because you will need them in the future. Now, before we end our talk, I want everyone watching to just remember four things, right? First, sustainability is not a one-time commitment. We've seen so many companies make green claims or sustainability claims for a particular product, but not pull through with it with their next products, right? And this is something that we call greenwashing, which is making your company appear more sustainable than what it really is. So if you are going to commit to sustainability, for example, accounting for the carbon of your game or rating your game, be prepared that you will have to do this for the titles that are coming up in the next couple of years. So sustainability is not a one-time commitment. Second is to not gatekeep your results. If, let's say, you work with a provider and they find out that you have a certain amount of emissions, or that there are certain processes within your development process that are not so sustainable, don't be afraid to disclose them. From what we've known, from talking with gamers and other game studios, just the fact that you actually disclose these information is already a big plus. So don't be scared to tell your gamers or your stakeholders that there are a lot of improvements need to be done to make your company and your game more sustainable. Because for most studios, this will be the first time that you will be doing it. So you are expected that the process is not perfect. The most important thing is to be transparent and don't gatekeep your findings. Third, although sustainability efforts within the company can initially start from marketing, because after all, sustainability needs to have a positive impact on business, right? There's nothing to be made sustainable if the studio doesn't exist. So for us, we understand that sustainability can initially come from marketing, but keep in mind that this will be eventually part of operations. So when you do commit to sustainability, don't just commit to it for the possible marketing opportunity, but keep in mind that in the long run, you will be required to change your processes, which can take a bit of time. And finally, when you release a game, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are going to be playing it. They're going to be seeing your message, and they're also going to have their own emissions. So if you are one of these developers, just keep in mind that you can use your platform for good. When you release your game, or if sustainability is something that is within of interest in your company, try to extend this within your fans as well. That's it for now. Thank you so much.